Social Studies 30-1, we're going to continue our source analysis. The theme of the week, of course, is totalitarianism. Uh, Today is a cartoon, so I'll give you a second or two to mull over the source, then we'll get into it. Things you're going to have to identify and point out. If you didn't know, this is Joseph Stalin, and you should recognize him because of the exaggerated mustache, but also the Soviet emblem on his hat. Maybe the star on his lapel. By the way, the Soviet flag is a hammer and sickle, red background with gold uh, symbols on the flag. Hammer and sickle, the hammer represented the factory workers, the sickle represented the farmers. Soviet flag. Anyway, other things you'll want to point out, maybe his military uniform, just to indicate his stature, that he is in charge, he is in command. And then for sure, you got to point out, I'm not sure if you know what this is called, but this is a cornucopia. Cornucopia is symbolic of something that is plentiful. Typically, a cornucopia should look something like that. Cornucopia demonstrates an abundance, a bounty of resources of food. It's usually um, exemplified during Thanksgiving, but it doesn't have to be. So cornucopia would be symbolic of abundance, of richness, of vast resources and wealth. And then the last thing you'd want to point out is that in this particular cornucopia, rather than fruit and vegetables falling out, in this case, it's, well, human skeletons. And you're going to want to talk about that. So what we're supposed to take away from the cartoon is that Stalin is presenting his system, his Soviet Union, his economic policy as something promising, something that will fulfill people's needs, enhance their quality of life. He's presenting them a cornucopia, but it's a phony cornucopia. It's a cornucopia that is going to lead to misery and suffering as symbolized by the skeletons rather than the abundance of fruit that should be coming out of the cornucopia. So he's promising a one thing, yet he's delivering another. And that's quite often what totalitarian regimes do is they promise you, they give you the appearance of the perfect ideal society, but when you dig deep, you realize it's not ideal or perfect at all. Maybe for the people in charge, but not for the general population. If we were to get really specific, he's probably referencing in the cartoon the Holodomor. The cost of Stalin's programs was the murder of millions of people. Ironically enough, a lot of them were people that communism was supposed to help. I mean, after all, a lot of the people that he murdered weren't kulaks or Ukrainians. They were other Soviet citizens too. But to be specific, it's probably a reference to the Holodomor. It's showing you the cost of Stalin's programs. It's not what he promised. It's not what appearance would tell us that totalitarianism in the form of Soviet Union was going to bring and bring people and give them. Didn't work out like it was supposed to. In terms of your links, I think for sure I see rule of law. This is what happens or what can happen when a government puts itself above the rule of law. And as we've learned, when you lose rule of law, people lose rights and freedoms. In this case, average Soviet citizens would have lost their individual rights and freedoms. You might link it to economic freedom or lack thereof. They didn't have any because of forced collectivization, 5-year plans, and so on. Finally, maybe self-interest in that the Soviet government, Stalin, is putting his and their self-interest first above everyone else at the expense of their rights and freedoms. Probably the cartoonist, and again, the cartoonist isn't supporting what he's depicted, he's critiquing what he's depicted. The cartoonist is clearly criticizing totalitarianism, clearly criticizing a regime that does not have accountability, does not have voting, does not have political opposition. So he's probably embracing or promoting liberalism because with liberalism in place, this should not be happening. With liberalism in place, the government abides by the rule of law. Your rights and freedoms are guaranteed by a charter or some kind of constitution, and you would not get these human rights abuses under a liberal regime. While we're at it, let's do source number 3, and we'll get this done for the week. Source number 3 is a quote. Again, I'll give you a few seconds to check over, um, figure out what he's trying to say, then we will attack this source, and then we'll link him together in a couple of minutes as well. Okay, that should be good. So things you'll want to point out, the new laws will a clear reference to the Nuremberg laws of 1935 in Germany. The anti-Jewish boycott had been going on for a while. Um, Fanatical laws against the Jews. So what he's trying to say, and I want you to think back to the notes from Nazi totalitarianism, there is a gradual devolution of rights and freedoms for Jews. It didn't happen all at once. Um, there had always been anti-Semitism in Germany, and then once the Nazis took power, they gave it more focus and began to legalize anti-Semitism. So there were a gradual series of laws that slowly eroded rights and freedoms for Jews, boycotts, the civil service law, culminating finally with the Nuremberg laws of 90 or 35. So the laws began as early as 33, but the actual Nuremberg laws don't happen until 1935. And so what he's basically saying is there had always been anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish feelings, boycotts, and so on, but the Nuremberg laws gave them a very enhanced focus. The Jew has now become, as he says, fair game for all, and the hunt has been made a legal national sport. Might be referencing the Holocaust, but I don't think we're quite there yet. I think he's talking about the Nuremberg laws and things that are going to happen because of it. So the government has legally taken away Jewish rights and freedoms. They are no longer citizens and now are fair game in what he calls the hunt of the Jew. In terms of our connections, again, I think we're talking about here's what happens when there's no rule of law. In this case, without rule of law, the Nazis are being above the rule of law. They're taking away rights and freedoms for minority groups, in this case, Jews in Germany. You might link it as well to self-interest, but I think your stronger links are rule of law and individual rights and freedoms. He's not overtly doing it, but clearly he is critical. The author is critical of the Nuremberg laws and what they've done to Jewish people. Um, and if anything, he would be advocating for greater degrees of liberalism and democracy because with those systems, you should not get um, a legalized boycott of part of your population, something like the Nuremberg laws, where you're legally taking away people's rights and freedoms and discriminating against them. So, if anything, maybe an inadvertent call for greater degrees of liberalism. He's certainly critiquing totalitarianism and for sure Nazi totalitarianism. Finally, we'll do our relationships and have this done for the week. So, to quickly take you through the sources, that was source number one. We covered that one just on Tuesday. Uh, a reference to the Stalin totalitarian dictatorship of the 30s and 40s. It was a reference as well to the Holodomor, the man-made famine of the kulaks, Ukrainian peoples of the former Soviet Union. Millions of them were starved to death on purpose. And then we just covered another reference to Stalin today, and there's your third reference, the Zuckerman quote. So, in terms of a link among the three sources, I would be thinking about number one, and again, just to refresh your memory, what we want to do at this point is we want to link them together with a common concept or theme. It could be as basic as totalitarianism. It might be something more specific like rule of law, when a government puts itself above the rule of law. Maybe what happens when people go without basic rights and freedoms. They culminate with mass murder. So clearly, sources 1, 2, and 3 are all referencing totalitarianism, the lack of rule of law, what happens when you take away people's rights and freedoms, and maybe the culmination of all those things ending up with mass murder. Because as we know, um, there was mass murder in Germany of Jewish people, then clearly there was mass murder in the former Soviet Union during the Holodomor. So that's probably as far as I would take uh, the, the theme and concept. Further relationships, well, I think you've already got two or three. You could talk about totalitarianism among all three. You could talk about lack of rule of law, rights and freedoms among all three, and finally mass murder among all three sources. I'm not sure there's a cause and effect because they are talking about different and separate historical events. If anything, um, source one is looking back on history, source two probably looking back on history. It almost looks like source three was written in real time as those things were going on. That could be another relationship that you go after with your sources. Well, good job with that. We'll do a new set of sources next week. It's important you continue to go through these and do them. It enhances your learning. Anything covered in class is intended to be supported with the sources and when we interpret the sources. So please keep doing them. It is very, very valuable. You're going to spend the rest of your life interpreting sources, whether it's in a newspaper or even maybe a tweet on your cell phone or something you see on TV. The rest of your life you're going to spend interpreting what people say, especially politically and economically.